Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Verse, the special part 2 of our review of the FTI Ethico report from last week. How's everybody doing today?
Doing well.
All right. So last week we had a ton of great comments, ton of great participation. And as always, on every Ethics Verse, we want this is for you. This is not for us. So ask your questions. We'll work those in. And today is really going to be a discussion going over the results from the study and creating some actionable, things that we can do to improve our programs and improve our lot in our companies and so forth. So as always, we say this every single week, and I'm going to keep saying it until it's no longer true, which means I'm going to be saying it forever. Your network is your net worth, and your network is not as big as it should be. So I encourage everybody today to drop their LinkedIn, URL, connect with somebody, and just recognize and remember that whatever you're going through, whether it's in your program or professionally, there's somebody probably on this chat and in this webinar today who's gone through it, who you can lean on, who you can share, or who you can ask for some help from. And, one of the most important and interesting aspects of this industry we're in, which many times we lose sight of, is how collegial it is. We're not all competing with each other, but rather we're all fighting the same battle in our own corners of the world to try to make our workplaces better, to increase the integrity and increase the ethics in our organization. And it's up to you to really take advantage of that. So I encourage you to do that. Drop into the chat where you're from. Hopefully everybody did what I said. I'm sure you guys did. Invited a friend for this week. And let's dive right in. So we're going to do a quick introduction here. So we're going to be solving compliance pain points. These are our practical applications from the survey data. So we have Angie and Anne-Marie from last week. Angie is managing director at FTI Consulting. Anne-Marie Wick is managing director as well. If you guys are tuning in, if you guys missed last week's episode, I encourage you to download it because there was so many, watch the replay. There were so many great takeaways from Angie and Anne-Marie. And we also got Mike Koenig today. He's the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at JBS. He, prior to joining JBS, he was in private practice and even served as a prosecutor and at the Department of Justice in DC, where he received a pretty prestigious award, the Assistant Attorney General's Award for Financial Integrity. So really excited to have you guys here, excited to dive in and pick your brains on getting some of these practical applications, from this eye-opening survey that has rocked our industry, not my words. Okay. Ethico, we have a suite of corporate integrity products, a software solution that helps you drive integrity, drive ethics to the heart of your business, from case management that helps you do the things that you do best, that helps you to stop doing, all that manual work and, working for a tool versus a tool working for you, exclusion screening and monitoring that helps make sure that you have no bad apples in the basket, and specialty solutions like exit interviews, pulse surveys, and training that does not stink. So if we can help you out with any of those things, please reach out anytime. Follow us on social. If you like the Ethics Verse, which I can't imagine why you wouldn't, you can sign up for the Ethics Verse and you'll be auto signed up for every single one of these. So you can get your CEU credits and attend the ones that you want. Follow Ethico's LinkedIn page. That's where we are getting the highlights from our podcast, The Ethics Experts, top 2% global podcast at this point. The best clips from the podcast, best clips from our webinar are going to be posted there. And you also can follow me if you like. Finally, we're doing the book giveaway because we always believe readers are leaders, and we're giving away 5 more books today. So let us, keep those great comments coming. Share your insights and your techniques. And with that, I will stop sharing this, if I can figure that out. And let's dive right in, guys, as I figure out how to work Zoom. Hopefully you guys don't deem this a IQ test. Let's first start talking about this thing that is, kind of woven throughout the entire report. And this was, how do we get a seat at the table where ethics and compliance can be kind of more part of those strategic discussions?
So that's a great Great question. And one of the big insights coming out of the study that we did. And it comes down, I think, to relevance and business partnership, and being able to, align your priorities, your ethics and compliance priorities with the business's objectives, establishing metrics and KPIs to demonstrate accountability and benefit to the organization, and nurturing relationships. You've got to build relationships with the business, maybe beyond just the technical part of what you're doing, but also really connect to the business benefit. And that's really, an overall headline is really about business partnership and moving to that space from just being a technical expert. And I'm sure Anne Marie and Mike both have points of view on that as well.
Yeah, I'll say just a few brief words, but I think Mike is going to have much more telling comments with his experiences. That, I look at the seat at the table. We're always thinking of, at the C-suite table, at the board table, which we obviously need to have that. But one thing we haven't talked about, at least last week as much, is also a seat at all the smaller tables, right? So that middle management and at the staff level, so that they find you as a trusted advisor, that they don't have a fear of coming to you and see you as a, open door office and ask their questions and feel comfortable coming to you with their questions, with their strategies, with their sales opportunities, with their bringing on new vendors, whatever it may be, right? So it's not just, I know we spent a lot of time talking about the board and the C-suite, but also throughout the organization. And I'm going to kind of tee that up for Mike, because I know, Mike, you've had some great experiences, particularly in your current role.
Mike,
It is
just,
You're good.
Good.
Am I good?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So a lot of it, I think, starts with what somebody said earlier, which is at the end of the day, and I don't care what industry you're in, the greatest lesson I've learned across 30 years is we are a people business. Relationships matter. People come to work with things that may have gone wrong at home that morning with their kids, with their significant others. And you have to be able to relate to people, especially as a chief compliance officer. One of the things that I faced coming in here as a former federal prosecutor and as a white collar criminal defense attorney was everybody still viewed me in that role. They thought I was here to be an enforcer, particularly given my prosecutorial background. I learned, and this is another thing that helps you integrate into a company. I learned after the fact that for the first 3 months here, everybody in the company called me FBI Mike because I used to wear a suit and tie every day. And here I am at a Midwestern meat company spread around the world, and I'm coming in a suit and a tie and a pocket square every day. And I look exactly like an FBI agent or a federal prosecutor. So part of, I think, being able to ingrain yourself into a company is becoming part of the culture that exists. One of the transitions I had from private practice to a company, that in private practice, you get to call your own shots. You are the final decision maker. When you're in a company, though, you're just one voice of many among leadership. So you really have to adapt your past experience to the role you're in. So I think that's a really important part, is realizing you're dealing with people on their terms all of a sudden, which is a very different experience than when you're a federal prosecutor or a criminal defense attorney, when you have a lot more say in what you do on a day-by-day basis. So that's one thing. The other thing I think that's important is that you really have to educate and not dictate. And everything I'm sharing with you are things I've probably learned the hard way. Lessons learned type thing. You come in initially and you have all these great ideas, and all of a sudden, you have 20 different constituencies. So the way to really gain traction, I think, is to make sure you're educating senior leadership. And as Anne Marie rightly said, it's not just senior leadership. You want everybody from the lowest level clerical person to the highest level senior executive to trust you, to be able to feel they can come to you to help solve their problems. So those would be the two things that I would suggest. Make sure to fit into the culture and understand your role in it. And then second of all, always try to educate them. Explain to people why you're doing something. Don't just tell them this is what they want to do. You do that in a company, and it is an absolute recipe for disaster.
Well, let's double click on that, Mike. The report said that between 26 and 32% of folks respondents said that senior leadership fully understands my role within the organization. I mean, that's a quarter or a third of people believe that senior leadership understands their role. That's a little bit shocking to me. You kind of alluded to, we need to become a trusted advisor in our organization. We need to educate folks. If you are one of those, 25, 33% people, how would you begin to change your lot in life, right? How would you begin to sort of turn those light bulbs on with respect to, leadership, understanding the purpose of the role and what the sort of breadth of your, impact could and should be?
It takes time. I mean, it's like any relationship. It takes time, and you have to, it's one of the great challenges you have, because as we all know, there's only 24 hours in a day. How do you apportion your time? And I think when you take on senior compliance roles, a good portion of your time has to be spent just building the relationships. It's no longer just sitting at your desk putting pen to paper. That's
Right.
one of the, when I first started in this role, my natural inclination, if an issue arose, was just to pop open my laptop and trying to solve the problem. Well, that's not the role I was in anymore.
Right.
So I think, one of the things as a compliance officer you have to do is you have to spend the time, because it will come back in spades when people start to trust you. It's sitting down with people for half an hour and an hour, and they're busy. But again, you've got to, and that also helps you understand what their problems are and what their concerns are. So it's time well spent, but it takes time. There's no magic formula for that. And then the other thing is, and I think either Anne Marie or Angie said this, and if they didn't say it today, they've said it before to me, you have to be a business partner. I think the most important thing above, in addition to the relationships, is you have got to be able to convince the business leaders that you're a partner with them, that you're not FBI Mike. I don't sit at my desk every day rooting through people's emails looking for the gotchas. And I know some compliance officers have that view of a compliance role. So part of this depends on what your perspective as a compliance officer is, on what your role is. My view of the role is I am here essentially to serve the businesses, to help them ideally prevent problems, to help them detect problems if we don't prevent them, and to remedy them. Those are the hallmarks of what you do in a compliance program. And you've got to be seen as a partner there. If someone comes to your office with a problem, you cannot berate them. You cannot criticize them. You cannot belittle them. That's not going to foster the kind of relationships you want to have so that you can help the overall enterprise succeed. So you really have to learn the business, and you have to be seen as someone who is, I think you used the phrase, Nick, a trusted advisor. In my perspective and my approach to being a compliance officer is I treat this company as I did my private clients. They are my clients. They come to me because they have problems, they have issues that they need help solving. And my role, much like I was as outside counsel, is to help them solve their problems as their partner. So I think those are how you try and do it, but it takes time. I'm going back to your core question. It takes time.
It takes time, it takes intentionality, and it takes kind of a posture that I think you described well when you were talking about, I'm helping my clients solve these problems, bringing that kind of a mentality in. I'm not forcing them to do things. I'm leading them toward the right answer. I think if you want to have a good relationship with your kids, you can't force them to do these things. You need to lead them to the right answer as well. And I think that constant, consistent intentionality with respect to these other folks in the organization, coupled with that practice of actually intentionally trying to build those relationships versus just putting our heads down and solving the problem ourselves, is really, to your point, going to create those massive, points of leverage. And what I would say is, if you're not spending 5 to 10% of your time each week trying to build relationships with other folks in the organization, you shouldn't be at the end of the year or 2 years from now wondering why you don't have any of these sort of meaningful relationships, or you're not that trusted advisor. You have to take those first steps forward, and you have to recognize, I think, kind of to Mike's point, that many times we're fighting against a caricature or a misconception about who we are and, our role as kind of gotcha or the police that can only be overcome individual by individual. But I think what's powerful is when you start having some of those conversations and they start talking, with each other, very quickly, that reputation can change. So your reputation within an organization, I say this stuff all the time, your reputation in the organization isn't going to change on a linear scale. It's going to happen little by little, and then all at once. You hit that tipping point, but it takes work, because otherwise you're just going to have to sit back and hope that, everybody forms their own mosaic of who you are, and all those, light bulbs turn on their own. You have to kind of drive that forward.
Yeah.
The only thing, Nick, I disagree with what you said is I think 5 to 10% is way underestimating, undervaluing how much time should be spent in building relationships. I think that I actually think it is a central part of the role. Because, and the other thing is too, and I think you started to touch on this, which is, if you can help one business unit leader solve one issue, you've actually just made 10 friends, because he or
100%.
she is going to go tell the other business unit leaders, and the word's going to percolate. Hey, you know what? That Koenig guy, he can be trusted. Those kinds of things. So I think that it is time, and it's also experience. I mean, again, one of the things that also always you have to balance as a compliance officer is, look, you want to be respected. People want to be liked, but at the end of the day, you sometimes do have to make tough calls. But the key is not just decreeing a tough call. The key is explaining why you're making the decisions. And the other thing is, and we didn't use this word yet, but I think it's really important, collaboration. You want to get all the people who might have an interest in a decision or an outcome in the room. I learned that when I was at the Justice Department. My supervisor said, when you're starting to make decisions, make sure the FBI agents are there, or the postal inspector agents, any law enforcement agency that might have a stake in the decisions you're making. Bring them into the room, bring them into the discussion to hear their point of view, and to make them feel that they're part of the process. And when people feel part of the process, I think they're much more vested in it, and you will get much more and much quicker positive results out of that.
What do you think, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, and I think with that building of the relationship and that collaboration and trust, particularly if you're newer to an organization, you have a great opportunity here, right? To go out and make sure you're going to the sales conferences, not to audit them, not to, judge them, but to learn. To say, I'm going to sit in the back and I'm going to observe. I'm going to learn what's important to your business. I'm going to learn what's important to the customers, so that, I can get more integrated and understand how I can help you when you have those challenges or those questions, just like Mike said, right? And I know, Mike, you did this. You've done a number of road shows where you've gone so that you're physically in the facility, particularly for those of you who have many facilities, whether they're all in the US or they're international, it doesn't matter. Put that face to the name, even beyond the video, right? And walk the halls, find out, what people talk about around the water cooler, and, just get to know people personally, right? So take that time to do those road shows. And I know there was a great comment here from Leslie, who said, I'm almost a year into my organization. I'm still building foundational relationships. That's fine. It may take some time, depending on how you're structured. Don't think of it as a clock is ticking and, oh my goodness, I haven't checked all these boxes. Take those opportunities. Like I said, if there's a sales conference, or even if, certain businesses have quarterly meetings, ask if you could just sit and observe and learn, and just to get to meet people. That's how you, build those relationships and have people get to know you as a person, as Mike mentioned, is take those opportunities. If you're sitting in your desk, in your home office, if you're sitting in your work office and you haven't seen, a dozen people a day, or talk to a dozen people a day, you're doing something, lacking. You need to be reaching out and having those conversations.
And, for many of us, I think, so spot on for sure. I think many of us, depending on our org size, like if you're ascending from a doer role to more of a chief role, you have to be able to make that transition, first of all. And if you are in, kind of what we call a walking hat rack, where you're doing all these things yourself, you have to Mike's point, carve out time to do those more strategic things, understanding the business, connecting with other people, and, bringing some of that collaboration forward. John made a great comment here. He said one of his professors, who is a chief privacy officer, gave an important reminder. Compliance professionals must make themselves approachable and likable within the organization, so that individuals with compliance concerns will perceive that they will be heard when they bring up a compliance concern. And that just goes back to what both of you guys were kind of just talking about. That approachability, that collaboration are kind of foundational elements if we're ever going to ascend to that trusted advisor role.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Nick, something that we talked about last week, some people raised their hands in the chats and said, I'm a department of one, or I just don't have enough people. And, where am I going to break away? I still have to get, 100 things done on my to-do list. By just spending a little bit more of that time and getting integrated with the business, building those collaborations, in essence, you're building compliance champions who can help you do your job, right? So they can be the eyes and the ears for you. If people, maybe they're just too busy, or they don't know how to contact you, and you're training to get them there, right? But they're your champions that can say, you know what, you need to reach out to Mike, you need to reach out to whomever is your chief compliance person, to, so that they, to Mike's point, is you get buy-in from one business leader, it'll spread. But also, even like I said, at that middle management level and elsewhere, get those compliance champions who are like, what, Mike really helped me in that, go call him, or, that's really going to help you serve the entire organization, particularly if you have a small group and you just are spread too thin.
I love that idea of a roadshow. The only, the big tip is do not show up in one of those FBI jackets where it says FBI on the back. Okay. That is not the type of vibe you want to cast forward. But let's talk about this. Like, I'd like to kind of I want to dive a little bit deeper into this, but in terms of like raising our profile with the executive board, or, even educating that, that group about what our role is. How do we do that more effectively? And what kind of like crazy misconceptions have you all seen, whether directly or with clients, what I'm saying, in the minds of, the people at the top, so to speak?
Mike, I'm going to have you.
Go ahead, Mike.
And again, it comes back to something I said earlier, and I'll use that as a foothold, which is, again, it takes time. These things do not happen automatically. And regardless of your credentials or your background, you have to, like anything, earn trust and confidence. So what I have done is, and again, every company is different. So every company comes into a different situation. We happen to have settlement agreements right now that are public, obviously, with the DOJ and the SEC. So I came into a situation where my background, had some specific ties to, the role I was going to fulfill. But one of the things I try and do is I always try and, again, this goes to the education point, explain to people why I'm making certain recommendations. And the best example in the compliance world, I think, is, the Department of Justice has a June 2020 evaluation of corporate compliance programs. It's what the Department of Justice expects to see in an effective compliance program. And whether you're a publicly traded company or not, it's still a good 20-page roadmap to the kinds of things you should be thinking about for the compliance function for your organization. So what I do is I sit down with the leaders and I say, look, this is not me wanting more resources or me wanting more money for my function or me wanting this or wanting it. It's what the Department of Justice expects. And I walk the leadership through the DOJ guidance and what they expect and how we can tailor it to our particular needs. Again, what the DOJ did in June of 2020, and I think it was one of the things the DOJ has done very well over the past several years, is they've issued this kind of guidance and checklist. And one of the things I also share with our company's leadership is that one of the three questions that the DOJ always asks is the compliance department adequately resourced and empowered to function? So again, that adds a level of independence to compliance, which again, the DOJ and the SEC and outside stakeholders want to see, that we're not just rubber stamps or whatever the business wants to do. So by doing it, it's not just, from a personal standpoint, I want this to be done for the company. It's saying from an educational standpoint, this is what the outside world expects from us. So I use those kinds of resources to help educate people. The other thing I do is I share with everybody that if you look at, again, I'm talking now from the Department of Justice. I hope it's not too narrow for the broader audience we have, but it's a good example. If you look at the Department of Justice right now, the head of the criminal division, Ken Polite, the head of the fraud section who oversees corporate matters, Glenn Leon, the woman who oversees the compliance unit, Lauren Koopman, they are all former compliance people. Ken Polite was a chief compliance officer of her company. Glenn Leon, for the past 8 years before he joined the fraud section, was the chief compliance officer of Hewlett Packard. Lauren came from private practice, where she helped companies work through issues with the DOJ and the SEC. So you've got three experienced compliance people in the fraud section and the Justice Department. And they recently hired Matt Galvin, who's considered to be the father of data analytics and compliance programs. So what I say to the leadership of my company is that 4 top people at the Department of Justice were all either former chief compliance officers or dealt from the defense perspective in the compliance world. There's no greater message that is sent than the Department of Justice views compliance as a top priority. Look at who's in the top positions. So when you start to show them that it's not just your own personal interest in having the right size department or the right resources. Right. You can show them that it's the outsiders who want it. That is something that I think has been very informative here. And then, of course, it's the carrot and the stick, right? Another thing I've used to try and make sure that we have a voice is I show them the cost of non-compliance. And I've got a whole slide that I always dedicate when I speak to different groups about what the cost of non-compliance is, both monetary costs, both the human toll of non-compliance, and those things seem to resonate and make people want us to be there. Again, you have to balance though. You can't just be the stick. You can't be the FBI. You also have to be the person who's going to help the company manage and navigate the situations they encounter.
I love that talk track. I mean, way to use what's going on in the world to provide some perspective to somebody who's not, a compliance nerd who doesn't know the names of all those people in those high seats. I mean, that should be an absolute talk track that every compliance officer, every compliance professional who's looking to gain more, understanding from their leadership, you should be using that to paint the picture on what the DOJ cares about. The DOJ kind of, almost to a fault, they always put their money where their mouth is, and they always signal what's important to them, whether it's through the guidance they put out or, the keynote speeches you can hear from any of these folks that share, using that, leveraging that, using those words, not against your boss, but, to inform them and educate them about what's most important is such a powerful way to reframe the tendency or reframe the misconception they might have that, oh, here's just the compliance person and they're just looking for some more resources selfishly. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. And Ken Polite, he gives a lot of speeches about this,
Yep.
But if people are interested in, I believe it was March 25th of 2022. I know it was March of 2022. He gave a speech at NYU Law that is available online.
Yep.
And it lays out what his philosophy is. So why wouldn't you use that, to educate your own people? Because that's not your words. That's the outsider's world, by the way, of the person who could be overseeing you at some point if things go wrong. So
well, it's the key to the test. It's the key to the test. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly right. It's exactly right.
What do you think about that, Angie? What do you think about all that genius Mike was just sharing?
I think Mike is a genius. So I think
You share that with Angie. Please feel free to share that with my wife at some point.
Let's write that down, please. Sign
That
it.
would undermine that. I hope this is being.
We'll put one of those seals on the bottom. Okay.
No, I think, that's absolutely right. You've got to educate people about, the why, as well as, what your jobs are. And then I think on an ongoing basis, in terms of, how do you raise your profile with the executive team and the board, there's some practical tips I can offer. One thing that we find is often people who are in more technical positions don't always speak the language of the board and the executive team. And it's important to learn how to do that. You have to learn the business, as Mike said, you have to understand the business and their goals. But then, you've got to be able to talk to them in that language when you're reporting out. And, if you were on it last week, you'll know that my background is communications and change management. And I remember quite a few years ago when I was working in-house and I needed, to get funding for a project. And I was sitting with one of our marketing people, and Nick, you made the point last week about marketing people don't panic about going in and asking for what they need or justifying the work that they're doing. And I was sitting with one of the marketing leaders, and we were talking about, this need I had to get some budget to get something done. And she's like, Angie, it's about revenue generation or cost avoidance. You need to make it about one of those two things, and then they'll hear you. And I was like, oh, okay. So it was reframing how I was talking about, what we needed to do, what the benefit was going to be. And that made all the difference. And, I would say, in addition to that, because that's fairly black and white, also connecting what you do always back to your company's strategic initiatives and how you're adding to that, how you're supporting that, and making sure you can articulate, what's the premium provided by, an ethical culture, by ethical business practices, on top of that. And, for some people in technical roles and compliance roles, communications might not be their natural instinct. And that's easily solved. Work with your communications function, get some training. If you don't have a communications function, there's plenty of outside people who can help, but get some help with that. How do I present all this and make sure I'm getting my message through and speak in their language?
So, I mean, Anne Marie, why do you think everybody is not taking advantage of having a lunch with a marketing person to get some of that training, as Angie just kind of alluded to? I mean, it's there for you, you know. You're on mute. So while you get that figured out, Mike, what would you say?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question because it's one of those that I think, you know, part of the challenge always is it's case by case basis and knowing your own people. So it's hard to pronounce, you know, proclamations across the board. So I was give that some thought. I want to, let me come back to that, Nick. I want to think about that because it's a good question that I want to give as broad-based advice as I can on.
Okay. Well, I'll give you my idea and then you guys can tell me how wrong I am. I think sometimes I think people in general, we don't want to ask for help for whatever reason. I think we have a bias to not ask for help. I think our imposter syndrome sometimes forces us to feel like, well, I should know this. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate, we don't appreciate the skills that are possessed in other areas of the business. Like it's not until, and maybe this is kind of looping back to like how important it is to build those relationships with other people in the organization. But like that quick sentence that marketing person shared that said, hey, it's about cost avoidance or it's about revenue production, that immediately turned on a quick light bulb that now you could bring to every single interaction with the board that comes so simple, but it only comes from, spending some time together and really kind of getting to know that person, So I think, and also I think the third piece is probably that we just, given our roles many times, given how overloaded and under budget, under resourced we are, we tend to kind of live in that first quadrant of like important, urgent, and we don't tend to, I've just seen it a lot. We don't carve out intentionally enough time in that sort of important, non-urgent bucket to do those things that are really going to be needle movers for us, which is, reframing how we, working on how we think about things or working on our relationships or some of these other, less urgent fires. It's like if you're always in firefighting mode, it's like you can never kind of stop and take a breath and sort of take care of yourself, so to speak. And I think relationships like that or building relationships like that or just carving out like enough mind space for you to have those kinds of conversations are super important, but many times those kind of fall down by the wayside.
Yeah.
Now, Nick, your answer has now triggered, I think, what is my lesson learned from this kind of experience. And that is, I came here as a lawyer with 28 years of experience. I viewed everything through the legal lens. The words they use here, metrics, parameters, margins, foreign to me. And that was a challenge. And it continues to be a challenge, by the way. But one of the constructive criticisms that I have received here is that you still sound too much like a lawyer. You're still not, integrating yourselves with the different groups of communication. So, and it was striking because when I was in private practice, what I used to do if I had a criminal case, I would talk to senior partners, mid-level partners, junior associates, young associates, the secretaries and the paralegals to get a worldview perspective that, whether I was a 40-year-old man at the time, 50, whatever it was, that I don't have.
Right.
So, I think that's the advice I would give is we've got to get outside of our own skin when you join a company. I mean, I think, and again, I don't know the experience levels of the different people on this call in terms of if you've been in-house your entire career or if you transitioned from private practice or government. But I think, and again, the older you get, the more difficult it is because you become set in your ways. And, one of the lessons I've learned here is you've got to get outside of what your narrow band of expertise is, because in a company, you're one small player. That's just a fact. I don't care how prominent your role is, how prominent your title is, it doesn't matter. You are still one piece of the puzzle, which is not always the case in whatever other area you've come from first.
What do you think, Angie?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's all about understanding the other person's point of view, right? And the other person's mindset. And if you really want to be heard, you need to speak in a language that they can understand. And sometimes you need to teach them to speak in a language that you understand. And that's teaching them the why and all of that. But I just want to comment too. I love John Barker's comment here about using LinkedIn to reach his internal colleagues and employees who follow him there. That's really interesting. I
mean, it's there for you, Mike, when when you were, in practice, you said you would talk to all these people, around your organization to get those different perspectives. You had to get up from your desk and go talk to that secretary, or go talk to that senior partner, or go talk to that associate. That took some intentionality. It took some, courage, I guess, if you want to say that. But it took kind of what I think it takes a prioritization of solving for the outcome. If you need this worldview, that's not going to just happen from your own brain. You have to get out there and talk to folks. And I mean, LinkedIn, I can't say enough great about it. There's phenomenal groups. There's so many people that you could cold reach out to somebody at another organization like yours that's in your same position and say, hey, can we meet for a 15-minute Zoom? I have a couple of questions that I'm struggling with, and it seems like you have, you might have some perspective on it. I guarantee 4 to 5 people will say yes, and you'll probably make that connection within the next week. But it takes that intentionality. It takes that willingness to put yourself out there. But again, I just can't. I'm going to always say this, like, our industry is so unique, it's so special, where that kind of a conversation is possible. Like, the marketing person at Coke is not reaching out to the marketing person at Pepsi and saying, how do you do ads in Dubai? You know what I'm saying? Like, those guys are against each other. We are, even if we're at sort of rival firms, we can reach out because our mandate, our goal supersedes the sort of, market dynamics that, our companies might be a part of. So I'm going to keep pushing folks to do that. Quick question here. How do we connect our work better? How do we connect the work that we do in ethics and compliance to our company's strategic objectives? Mike, when you came in, maybe we can start with you. When you came in, how quickly, or like how long did it take you to see the importance of doing that? And what kind of hacks have you developed to ensure that as you're communicating, you're tying those things to those objectives time and time again?
Well, I've been here 18 months and I still am doing that on a daily basis. So again, I don't think you can view it as it just happens. What you do, first of all, you have to sit with leadership to understand what they want. And, I think the mistake that you can make, and I think I probably made this early on, was, well, I knew what an effective compliance program is. I knew what the Department of Justice expected. So I'm just going to come in, here's your playbook. And, nobody paid attention to that. So again, the one good thing about this, Nick, is the themes repeat themselves. You need to take the time to build the relationships with the leaderships so they will accept what you do. And when you speak to them, what I did in my first 4 weeks here, I met with 38 of the most senior people in this building to understand what they thought ethics and compliance was, where they thought the company had done well before, where they thought the company, could do better, how I could help them. And, what emerged from those things, for example, was one of the uniform themes was we need to do better training. When you talk to enough people, similar themes emerge. Now, I still have that notebook. And every couple months, I go back and I look back at what I learned in those first 4 weeks from everybody, so I could understand what strategic objectives are. What's the saying? And again, I think we all suffer from this. And again, based upon different stages of your career, but graveyards are filled with indispensable people.
Right.
I'm the chief compliance officer at this company. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, God forbid, guess what? They're going to have the chief compliance officer in here. So the point is that you really got to understand what their needs are, not your own needs. And then you see them mold those two together. You come in with ideas, and again, it depends on your level of experience. I'd come here with my background as both in government and private practice. So I did kind of have a perspective, but I needed to learn how that perspective would fit into the company's objectives, not the other way around. Companies are not going to adjust to a compliance officer's view.
Correct.
You've got to take your view as a compliance officer and help educate the company as to why that needs to be incorporated into their strategic objectives. Right. At least that's my experience. And again, it goes back to what I said early on. You have to educate, you can't dictate.
I mean, the company doesn't work for the compliance officer. The compliance officer in its basic form works for the company. And if you're doing your job right, you're helping the company be more successful by providing clarity around where the rule, where the lines on the field are, or where the lines on the side of the road are, so that business can go faster. It's a subtle shift, but it's an important one. A couple minutes ago, John brought up this challenge, and I'd love to hear both of your perspective on this. But one challenge inside some organization is the lack of understanding between legal and compliance functions. Many lawyers, including GCs and outside law firms, don't understand the distinction. This is a challenge for compliance. How have you seen that? Let's talk about this dynamic and what we can do to kind of clear that up, because there were some there were some data points in the study that kind of alluded to this kind of, tension, you know what I mean?
Well, I see it every day. Let me also add, I just got a message from Anne Marie. She is not getting off on, she's having difficulty with her microphone. I know she'd like to chime in on some of these things, and she just said she's in via phone now, I guess. So
Okay, good.
she is having mic issues. So we did a focus group about 2 weeks ago internally. And one of the key findings of that internal focus group was no one understands the difference between legal, compliance, and sometimes HR as well. And the interesting thing is, there is a tremendous amount of overlap between compliance and legal by nature of it. And people don't know who to call. So our legal department here has been much more entrenched in our ethics and compliance historically. So people still think they go to legal for everything. We have started to, as we train and communicate better explain the different roles. But the reality is there is a lot of overlap. So what we tell people is, look, bring it to one of our attention. So if somebody brings something to my attention, but it's more legal, I'll send it over to our general counsel. Conversely, when something is more compliance, she will bring it over to me. And very often we sit together and work through the issues. So there really isn't a bright line between legal and compliance. I don't report to now, this also can depend on how the corporation is structured. I don't report to the GC. She doesn't report to me. We both report up to our chief legal officer. So there's not a reporting. Some companies, I know the chief ethics officer reports up to the general counsel. That sometimes can create a conflict, sometimes not. It just depends on the particular company in the particular situation. So I think what it's a matter of is delineating to the best you can what falls within what bucket, but understanding that really it's not a bright line like you'd like to have it.
What do you think, Angie?
Yeah, we actually do see that a lot. I'm actually working with a client right now that up until, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago, had one function called legal and compliance. And they have since split them apart into 2 separate functions because that's more, in keeping with what the enforcement agencies want to see. But there's a lot of confusion among the employee base about what's the difference between you two, who do I go for what? And there's actually some confusion too among the people in the 2 separate departments, because some of them used to be in the one collective department. And so, we're going to be facilitating a workshop basically with the 2 groups to talk about, all right, let's talk about where the line is, and so that we can be clear among ourselves and we can be clear with the whole organization about what the difference is between what we do in legal and what we do in compliance.
Yeah,
and
when there's that confusion, I'm sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it may be, those definitions, those specific definitions might be a little bit different, for each company.
Right. But understanding those lines of demarcation between legal and compliance, irrespective of what's going on in the organization, it must be clear between those 2 groups, I think, to the extent possible, if those groups are going to present a united front to the organization as a whole. I think a lot of damage can be done to each and both of those brands, frankly, within an organization when there seems to be confusion around something that's so important.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to help this client work through, in the next few weeks.
And we're working on that as well, Nick, because again, we did a focus group and found that was a real problem and a real concern. And I don't know what the answer is. And I'd be interested to hear anybody who's listening, if you have answers or solutions to that, please send them my way, because it is something that we wrestle with and haven't yet found the right solution for.
Oh, here's John. Oh, are you there, Anne Marie?
Yeah, I am so sorry.
She's back. Okay, very good. We were floundering here without you, so glad to have you back.
Oh, no, you guys are doing great. My sincere apologies. So not only was my mic not working, but then my computer decided to completely shut down and it's doing some Windows scary stuff. So right now, so my sincere apologies.
No problem.
But as I'm listening to all of your conversation on this, is that, doesn't this tie exactly with what the survey results were?
Yeah,
right.
It does.
Is that people don't understand what my role is. And I think this comment was already made, so I apologize if I am repeating it, but you still want to build the collaboration, that they're raising their hand in some way, shape, or form, right? And reaching out to someone. You'd rather have them go to the wrong department than to not go to a department at all.
Good point.
In my mind. So
we got a great comment from John. Is this the John Hughes? How's it going, John? He said, I think this also gets convoluted when your compliance is also Oops, it just moved. Too many comments. I'm just kidding. It also gets convoluted when your compliance is also ethics. There are times when a company decision is legal, but it might not be the most ethical choice, and that can create tension between the GC and the chief compliance officer. Thanks for your comment, John. What do you guys think about that? That's an interesting perspective.
I've never encountered that directly. I can certainly see it conceptually as how that could happen. You know, in the experiences where I suppose it could have conceivably happened here, our general counsel and I sit 20 feet from each other.
Yeah.
And, you know, we both have enough experience that I think if we saw things like that on our radars, we'd consult with each other. So in other words, if our general counsel saw something that might be perfectly legal, but might, you know, maybe dance over the line of compliance or ethics, I have every trust and confidence in the world that she would come to me and we would talk about it in advance. So I can't say I've had the bad end of that experience, but I could certainly see how it happens. And that's what creates challenges and why a lot of these things come down to judgment calls. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think as a chief compliance officer, no different than a general counsel, no different than a private practitioner. At the end of the day, you give your client, whether it's, you know, a private client or a company you work for, you give them their options, you give them the consequences of those actions based upon of those different courses of action based upon your experience. And if asked, you give a recommendation. And you know that I think is the best you can do in those kinds of situations. Obviously, unless it's so patently improper, in which case there's a whole bunch of other obligations that you may have. So I'm not talking about those clear-cut ones. I'm talking about the judgment calls that you know could raise the tension, you know, that you would raise.
I mean, look, don't be in this industry if you're not comfortable kind of like grappling with the gray, as they say, right? I mean, we swim in the gray. That's many times the life that we live. I'd love to do a quick poll as we start talking about this, and I want to crowdsource from you guys what the options should be. But Mike, you said, you know, different sort of setups of who compliance reports up through can work in different situations. You know, I'm not going to sort of lead the witness. Other people would have said, you know, no, it must be this kind of a, you know, a kind of a setup and, you know, to avoid conflicts and stuff like this. And so what should the options on this poll be? Legal, general counsel, what do you think? Directly to the board? What is the kind of mutually exclusive, selectively exhaustive or collectively exhaustive list of options for this poll that I'm about to send out? When I say I mean Jack, of course.
All right, so, you know, your reporting possibilities are to the general counsel. I know that there are some compliance officers who report to the CFO. I know there are some who report to a full board. There are some who report to an audit committee. There are some who report to a chief legal officer, if it's different than the general counsel.
Okay,
I think that,
let's go with those.
I mean, Anne-Marie or Angie, if I'm missing any, the CEO.
I would add CEO.
Yeah,
So
I
you
would
know.
say there's also two that I've seen. CEO, if you can get there. I've seen some of those. But if your company has like a chief administrative officer or a operating officer, that gets you up to the C-suite without CEO sometimes.
Okay, you got those, Jack? I'm going to send these in the chat to you, buddy, and then we can send those. But there were some pretty interesting interesting stats, and I want to kind of address these. So my role is clearly and properly defined. Less than 40%, about a third were there. Hit this. So we got 200 people in the chat. Let's get a full votes from everybody. Where should compliance report to? Single choice available: legal, general counsel, CFO, full board, audit committee, CEO, and chief administrative officer. Okay. So less than between 32 and 36% feel like the role is properly defined. And less than 40% feel like they have enough independence to provide honest feedback. That is a critical, I mean, that percentage is way too low in my opinion. But let me get a reaction from you guys about this kind of, you know, this kind of dynamic that a lot of folks, I mean, according to the data, struggle with as we wait for these 200 poll results to come back. Let's kind of dive into first the independence issue. 38% think they don't have enough independence to provide honest feedback. And, I'd like to maybe couple this actually with this other stat that says that 41%, kind of around the same number, feel that leadership puts pressure on them to downplay ethics and compliance risks when presenting to the board. I mean, that's a clear kind of independence issue. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think this varies based upon your experience level, based upon your own personal bend towards things. And when I joined, and again, I'm going to speak solely from a personal experience here. When I joined, I came here with 28 years of experience, and and the company wanted this, that they wanted, and I said that I would give them my honest, unvarnished opinions and thoughts and recommendations when asked to do so, or when I thought was necessary. And, no one ever, God forbid, wants to be fired. But, but the good news for me was leadership wanted that. That doesn't mean they always agree with me. I have never once ever been asked to downplay anything with regard to any reporting obligation I may have. I just don't have that kind of relationship with the company. They don't expect it, and I wouldn't do it. So, that's my answer to that, which is, but I'm certainly cognizant of that fact, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm an employee at will, right? If I say something, recommend something that the board ultimately doesn't like, or the chief legal officer doesn't like, they could say, you know what, Mike, thank you for your service. But I think that's true in any job in America, right? If you're a young associate and you voice an opinion to a senior partner that they don't like, that's not good for career development, right? We all know that. So it is a good question, but I do think when you have a compliance, it's not an easy job. I mean, being a compliance officer, much like being a general counsel of the company, I think they're very similar positions in that sense, right? Is you live to some degree at the will or the whim in the worst case scenarios of the leadership. Thankfully, I have not encountered that for a split second of my time here. But I just think you have to maintain the independence, and look, you have support in needing that, because going back to what we said early on, was the DOJ at least expects compliance officers to be empowered to function. That necessarily requires a level of independence.
So, I mean, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, it sounds like, well, we just need to prioritize what we think is right and prioritize, what our opinion is, and kind of see, let the chips fall where they may. That's not probably a license to be a jerk, all right? We have to be smart, we have to be effective in all that kind of stuff. But to your point, to the extent, let me ask it this way, I guess, like if you were facing pressure as, this huge proportion of folks feel, 41%, if you were feeling this pressure to downplay ethics and compliance risks when presenting to the board, how do you feel you might deal with that?
I think it comes back, and it's funny because as we're having this conversation now over almost the past hour, there's similar themes that emerge. And I think the way to address that is you make sure you're educating your leadership from the beginning. You're getting their buy-in, you're getting their thoughts, you're explaining to them why this is important. So the more you can educate and not dictate, again, coming back to that phrase, which I only thought of this morning as I was thinking about today's session, that is the key to being able to hopefully avoid those kinds of issues.
Right. I like that. Educate and not dictate. That's a
right. And I think that's how you can, that's okay. That's fine. And I most of the quotes I have, I've stolen from somebody, so it's okay.
Okay.
Believe me. But all kidding aside, I just think that the more collaborative you can be, and this is coming from a lessons learned experience, having been in-house now for 18 months, the more collaborative you can be, and the earlier you can be collaborative and do it, the far more likelihood of success you're going to have. Again, limited to my experience. I can't speak for other companies.
What do you think, Anne Marie? Oh, sorry, Angie, go ahead.
I was thinking some of the same things, that this sort of wraps into a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Definitely, I would feel a need to understand, why are they not giving me the independence? Why are they putting pressure on me to downplay this? Is it an education issue? Is it a leadership issue? What is it? And therefore, what do I need to do about it? But education certainly could be part of it. Understanding how to better communicate with them and better position yourself, in that leadership role could be part of it.
Right.
And it may ultimately come down, as Mike said, maybe the leadership is just not, there, and it may not be a battle you can win. Hopefully that's not the case. But it's probably a combination of several of those things.
Well, Thomas said you're better off finding another company if they can't take the truth. Allison said, I left a good job because I was told to do something I knew was not in compliance with regulations. Angela had the same thing. So at some point you have to kind of vote with your feet after you've, tried to stand for what's right. And I think, no one's career is probably going to be devoid of, tough situations like that, where you're asked to do something wrong, or, your ethics are threatened. And it's important to kind of make the right decision for, yourself and what you know to be right.
Yeah, and look, it's easy to say. I mean, and part of the challenge with this concept is it's easy to say that if faced with that kind of a question, we all like to think we'd walk away, right? I mean, if you're asked to do something you don't believe is right. On the other hand, you've got a spouse or significant other, you've got 3 kids, 2 college tuitions due. So this is where the real, and look, having prosecuted individuals and having defended a lot of individuals, that's where human pressures come to bear. And you are put in a trick box sometimes. And again, look, at the end of the day, it's always better to try to find a new job than go to federal prison. I mean, I know that's kind of a trite comment, but it's true. So at the end of the day, you have to evaluate what situation you're in. Is leadership asking me to do something that I don't agree with? It's not the course of action I would take, but you know what? It's not unethical. It's not illegal.
Right.
So that's their decision. Or are they asking me, to start helping them shred documents, that have just been subpoenaed by the Department of Justice or the SEC? That's a clear problem. So again, I've just given the ends of the spectrum. And of course, the problem is that's not helpful, because most of the situations we all encounter are somewhere between those extremes. But that's when what you have to do is you have to analyze yourself. The other thing I encourage people to do, talk to your colleagues, talk to a trusted colleague who understands. Always get objective advice. I mean, I don't care how smart you are in whatever field you are. What's the old, never be your own lawyer, right? Any lawyer who hires anybody who represents himself as a fool for a client. I very often to this day will call friends I've made over the past 30 years, to run a situation when I was in private practice, not so much here, and say, what do you think? Or get help thinking through some of these things.
I love that. Never be your own lawyer. They also say that about dentists, I think. Let's talk about likelihood to recommend. So this is like, this was so shocking to me, this net promoter score. And this was like abysmal net promoter scores across these 3 questions. Would you recommend someone joins your compliance team? Would you recommend someone joins your organization? And would you recommend a friend adopts your compliance program initiatives? They were all like -30, -35. So those are like terrible numbers. What do we do about this problem? How do we start to change those things? And which, and maybe ask it, maybe I can ask it a different way for, a little bit of fodder for this conversation, is like, which of the things we talked about do you think would have the biggest impact on, this net promoter score at large?
I think really, shifting your view about what our function contributes to the business and starting to really articulate that so that you can communicate it and feel like you are participating more strategically in the business, is definitely one thing. I mean, one thing I would encourage everybody to do, if you haven't done this already, you've got to connect your work to the purpose and the values of the company. And we know, especially younger employees today, they want to work for an ethical company. They want to see that in the purpose and the values. So if you haven't connected those dots already, do that. I would also encourage you to, articulate what is your value proposition as a compliance function. What's your value proposition to the business? And actually write it down. Get your elevator speech, down so that everybody in your department knows it, can repeat it. And it's your key message over and over and over again. Here's what we're here for. This is what we do. Here's how we contribute to the business. And it's, connecting all these dots for people so that you can raise your game up to a more strategic level, and you're going to feel better about the work you're doing. If you do that, and then, back to that relationship building conversation that we've been having, when it feels like you don't have time for that, think about solving the long-term problem versus solving that urgent, immediate thing that's right in front of you. Yes, they're both important, but you're never going to get past that short-term thing if you don't put some time into the long-term thing. And that will also raise your game a little bit.
I mean, spending 60 minutes writing a 60-second elevator pitch for your team that articulates the value that you bring to the business, what your mandate is, how you end up impacting those around you, and making everybody on your team literally memorize that script can probably do a lot to change the minds of what we do. What percentage of ethics and compliance officers are doing that? I bet it's an extremely small percentage. Being able to articulate that quickly, getting that elevator pitch dialed in, it's such a powerful way to frame out who you are, the role that you play, and start chipping away at that, reputation that many times we didn't even earn, that it's just been kind of cast on us,
Yeah. And work with your team to develop that elevator pitch, because you'll get them talking about what we do, why we do it, why it matters to us, why it matters to the company, and they'll be invested in it. They'll feel good about it. And, and then it's your key message that you need to keep repeating so that people know what you're about. I mean, we have a lot of clients too, Mike's one of them, who have branded their program in a way that, captures, that overarching value that you're bringing. So it's right there for everybody to be, reminded.
Tell us some more about that branding, because that sounds very smart.
Yeah. So, one thing we do often in communications is create a campaign or a brand that carries that key, what is the thing you really want people to take to heart. And it's always sort of present, visually. You don't have to say the words every time, but everything you're doing then kind of lives under that umbrella, gets tied to it. It starts to sink into people's memories. Mike, I think yours is integrity drives excellence.
Cool.
And, that's a message they want people to hear. And, that can go along with your value proposition. It's usually a little bit longer. It's a, 2, 3, 4 line, elevator speech. But helping people remember what you're about, even if it's subconsciously sinking into them, is something that you can do to help draw more attention and understanding, to the work that you're doing and how you contribute.
What do you think, Anne-Marie?
So it is so good to be back. I am so
Glad
sorry.
you're back. Round of applause for Anne-Marie. She's back. We were on the edge of our seats for the last couple of minutes here.
You were on the edge of your seat. I was wondering, how am I going to get back? Because then all of a sudden I got that horrible blue screen circular that I'm
Oh
like,
my
no,
gosh.
computer crash. So I am so sorry.
But we are just resilient. That's how we are. We're just resilient. We're tenacious. We make it happen. I love it.
I knew the three of you are more brilliant than I, so you guys were going to keep it running. So, and I'm kind of actually going back to your question of, for those who answer about, I don't want people to join my department, or, how do I move the needle on this? And what have we talked about that ties so much to this is really that collaboration, is really that have people get to know you and you them. And that ties into what we were just talking about, the elevator speech. I like to think about, if you were going to a party, okay, now remember, the people with whom you're working at, within your organization are not compliance people, right? They're salespeople, they're marketing, they're procurement, they're accounting. They've all raised up in a different environment, right? So if you're going to a cocktail party and someone says, hey, what do you do for a living? You're not going to go through a boring 5-minute, discussion. No offense, Mike, on the Department of Justice. That,
Wow, Mike just ejected her from the meeting after that little dig. But I think her point is taken, right? We're going to cut down to what the value we bring. We're going to put it on the back of a Post-it note. We're going to put it on a little note card, and be able to, within 100 words or within 75 words, convey the essence of what we do. And the best way to do that is to focus on the result that our efforts drive.
And if I can add to that, in that whole collaboration piece and that whole building out within the organization, nothing is more energizing than when someone comes to you and says, I need help. And it's not, you could arguably call it an ego boost, but it's frankly, it's all right. The message is coming across that I can help right? And that I can be an active participant in the operations of the organization, and that I'm not person that they come through, frankly, once there's a raging fire. You want them to come to you when there's smoke or a possibility of smoke, not when the forest is already halfway burned down, right?
You got it.
So it's, help me help you. We talked about this last week. Help me help you. That is so energizing. And if those who are filling out the survey that were more on the, I don't want people to work into my department or even my company, that's the easiest shift, is when you actually have people coming to you saying, come to the party and let's have a conversation. That's where you get energized.
Right. So here's a great comment. Go ahead, buddy. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it still comes back, and I'd be interested to hear comments floating across about this. It's still fighting that perception.
Right.
Ethics and compliance, legal, HR, in a company setting, you're kind of like the afterthought. You're not promoting the business. And I just, and to the extent people have ideas of how they've overcome that, it's creating the culture of compliance. And thankfully it starts with leadership, and we've got tremendous leadership support here. But it is a matter of changing those perceptions about what our role is. And I've tried to portray it. Our role is to help. But it is still, I think, a message that gets lost on people. They still think you're like internal affairs.
So I'd love to hear from some folks in the audience. We have, over 150 people in the audience. How have you attacked this? How have you put, what are the main notes in your elevator pitch that have allowed you to reframe and show what your value is, to Mike's point, because many times it is a battle, right? It is a battle to overcome this perception that people have about what role we play in the value creation of the broader organization. While you guys are dropping those ideas, tips, tactics, and techniques into the chat, I want to read this comment from Deb and hear the panel's reaction to it. So Deb said, in the federal sentencing guidelines, compliance is mentioned 188 times. Ethics is mentioned only 10 times. It's my personal opinion that emphasizing compliance over ethics is the wrong direction. As previously mentioned by John Hughes, you can make a decision that is compliant with the rule or regulation, and it may not be ethical because of the way the regulation was written. Somebody else replied and said, McKinley said, agree, Deb, compliance is just the floor. What do you think of this sentiment about it going the wrong direction? Do you read it that way? I'd love to hear your reactions.
Well, I'll start. Oh, I'm not sure I'll be very articulate on this, because it's an interesting phrase, because, I have always been the ethics and compliance officer. I think they are wedded together. I think you have law, regulations, policies, those are compliance type things. And ethics is, ethics to me is a much grayer area than compliance. So it's not grayer in the sense it's not important, but grayer in the sense it's harder to judge, right? What are your ethics? Think about, I hesitate to dive into this because it is certainly not a political statement in any way, shape, or form. But think about a lot of the companies that struggle in the wake of the Dobbs decision out of the Supreme Court that overruled Roe versus Wade, right? You can be compliant with certain laws about what companies are going to do or not, but you may have a different ethical code. Now, what's going to govern your, so that becomes a very difficult answer. Ethics to me is more, I guess, the higher level principled thing. Is this the ethical thing to do? Whereas compliance is more the law, the regulations, and things like that. You have to be compliant. Compliant with what? Compliant with the laws and regulations. Ethics, it's a different, more, I guess, conversational topic for every company to take on. There are clearly things that are unethical, but typically what's so clearly unethical, in all likelihood, does probably violate, if not a law or regulation, it may violate your company policy or procedure. So again, it's a case-by-case analysis. And as I promised when I started this, I'm not sure I'm being as articulate as I would like to be, because I think it is a difficult question. I think ethics is probably an add-on to compliance, no less important necessarily, but I guess that's the way to distinguish them. But I would be, if anybody has any thoughts on how I can do this better, please chime in.
Yeah, just only because I still have audio and video for a nanosecond. I'm
Let's
gonna
do it
jump in
quickly.
here.
Talk quickly.
Small victories, I tell you, it's small victories today. Is that, compliance is, you can arguably teach that. You can teach how to comply with a policy. You can teach why we have certain policies. You can educate on the compliance. And going back to the original comment in the chat about why does the Department of Justice mention the word compliance 188 times, is they're talking about also an effective compliance program and following their regulations, okay? When you talk about ethics, that's foundational, that's morals. You are starting to build your ethical code probably by the time you're in kindergarten, right? And then you continue to develop that as an adult. And it's different than complying with the law. It is, what is your moral code, right? And so that is, I think, a different, that I don't think the Department of Justice is going to say, this is how your ethics needs to be. They're going to say, this is how your compliance with the law needs to be and regulations.
Yeah.
Much more articulate than I said it, but yes, Anne-Marie, that is definitely a clearer summary of what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I've heard from more than one or two of my clients that they don't like to use the word compliance because they think it turns people off. It implies just, the rules. They prefer ethics, or they prefer integrity or something like that, that implies that higher moral code. So that's, I think Anne-Marie's right about why the DOJ wrote their guidance the way they did, but from a people's perception point of view, a lot of companies don't like to use the word compliance because it just doesn't land right with people. And I also like the comment that John Barker made a few minutes ago here about highlighting success stories. And again, value you brought to the business, how it made a difference, instead of just the horror stories, to reinforce what you've contributed, what you're doing. It just comes back to communications over and over again in education.
When we're talking about our compliance culture, I love this question because more than half of the people that we've talked to have a real trouble getting at what I'm about to ask. How do we measure our compliance culture? We're not getting into the branding of ethics, compliance, integrity, all that kind of stuff. We're talking about, call it whatever you want, but how do we measure it? Is it completion rates? What is it?
Yeah, it's a myth that you can't measure culture. You can measure culture, and you can measure it with data. And more importantly, for this conversation, you can measure the state of compliance within your culture. A lot of companies, add a question or two to their employee engagement survey or to their overall culture assessment. And that's typically not going to be enough to get you the information and the insights that you need to really understand where is compliance in your culture, where are the gaps, where are the problems, what do you need to do about it? The approach is the same, it's a survey, right? But the questions are different. And the data and insights that you get out of it are different. And you need data that you can actually act on to shift people's mindsets, shift their behaviors. That's the culture piece of it. In terms of, how do you measure the success of your program overall? One thing I like to encourage people to do is think about it on 3 levels. The first level is what we call output, which are, things you can count. How many trainings did we do? How many people completed on time? How many investigations have we completed? All those kinds of things that you can count. The next level up is impact. What behaviors and attitudes can we observe that have changed because of what we've done? So do we have better understanding of policies and procedures? Do we have people more confident in the reporting mechanisms, and are they using them? Do our people understand and believe that ethics and compliance is a competitive advantage? Those kinds of things. And then finally, the last level is outcome. What are the business results that we can impact? And that's where you want to be connecting yourself to, how are we contributing to employee retention? How are we contributing to talent attraction, getting the people that we want, coming to our door? What about our corporate reputation? What about profitability? What about, financial flexibility and the opportunity costs? Because those can be impacted if you have huge fines that, are limiting you. So when you're thinking about measurement, try to think about it at those 3 levels and decide what's right for your business and your department. But also think, in that middle column about if you really want to measure the culture, the compliance culture, it takes a specialized tool to do it. It's a little bit of extra work. It's not a lot of extra work. It's not a lot of extra money, actually, especially compared to what you get out of it. But it can give you the information you need to really do something about the culture and moving it forward. And I know Mike can talk about that firsthand.
So we're talking about output. What is it? Output, impact,
output,
outcome.
Impact, outcome.
That's a great frame to start looking for, data points that we can use to prove, I guess, the impact of our program, or prove to ourselves at least that progress is being made,
Yeah, and track and
Right.
report out on it to the powers that be.
And without jumping, I'm going to let Mike jump in, but real quick, the key phrase of ROI that we talked about last week.
Yeah, that's it. That's right. I want to get to that next. What were you going to add to what Angie said, Mike?
Here's the challenge, and I've learned a lot from Angie about this issue, because one of the things the Department of Justice expects as part of an effective compliance program is, have you tested your system to know that it's effective? So how do we do 50 trainings a year. How do I know if it's effective? I know I talk to an audience of people. I know they nod politely and they ask questions and they sign their attendance sheet. But does that mean they're really going to go back and do the right thing?
Right.
The challenge with, I think, measuring the effectiveness of compliance that I have, and I talked to Angie about this ad nauseum, is, if our CEO says we have to cut our travel by 15%, our travel budget by 15%, that is an objective number that at the end of the year, you can look at last year's number, you can look at this year's number and determine, did you reduce it by 15%? Or can you cut water usage at your plants by 12%? You can look at, there are objective, measurable parameters to look at. Compliance, the phrase I like to use with this is, in compliance, we don't solve math problems, right? They're more often than not judgments that had to be made based upon factual scenarios that present themselves. And the facts that present themselves on Monday may be different than they are on Thursday, so you make judgments. How do you measure if your judgment was right? I jokingly say, I'm successful if nobody at my company gets indicted. Now, that is really not the standard of ethics and compliance that you want to have. Is an objective measure, though, right? No indictments this week. Okay, chalk that up as a win. No civil lawsuits this week. Chalk that up as a win. Those are objective measures, but they're meaningless, because that's not really what an effective corporate culture should be, shooting for the bare minimum like that. So I think Angie's suggestions are very good ones, but they don't intuitively resonate with the businesses, because I've learned this in many ways, businesses focus on numbers. Everybody wants my numbers, my parameters, my metrics, my data points,
Right.
words I've never used before August of 2021. But that's what they're used to. And ethics and compliance doesn't fit neatly into that kind of categorization. So I think what you have to do is you have to educate leadership and educate the Department of Justice and the DOJ and they know this because they're experienced people there, that the measurements by which we evaluate compliance are different than the measurements by which we evaluate, output or profitability or margins or things like that. It's just a different analysis. And I think, educating people like that is the first step to being able to get your arms around it. Angie and Marie,
I partly agree with that. I think the education piece is critical, because we're not spitting widgets out of a machine, to your point, right? It's a lot more amorphous. There's second and third order impacts that are maybe harder to draw a direct line to. I think, though, in that sort of amorphousness of it, and knowing that the people that we're trying to prove our worth to acclimate, that's their language, they acclimate to numbers. We can take a page out of, a McKinsey consultant's book. I mean, look, any McKinsey consultant, any Bain consultant you talk to can probably get about 80% close to the answer without doing any analysis. They can ask a couple of questions and come down to some number that's probably about 80% correct. And they, the ones that I've worked with and the ones that I know, they can pretty quickly put their finger on the pulse and say, look, I don't know whether, I don't know the exact angle of the wind right now, but it's kind of a north by northwest. If we can take both of those, if I'm just saying, if we can lead with some numbers that can give a general picture that probably, hopefully kind of corroborates the gut, impression we have about the state of affairs, and use that interaction as a basis to educate and do those broader things, not only to get credit for those second and third order impacts, but to let them actually understand that this is not, a widget machine. I think that's a way to kind of fast forward versus kind of like fighting City Hall, so to speak. Which I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I just think it could be a little bit of a mix,
Yeah.
No, it's a good point, Nick. And again, I struggle with it, and Angie can testify to the struggles I have with this.
It is hard. I mean, it's in my communications world, we've struggled with the same thing for, centuries. It doesn't lend itself to exact metrics like that. You've got to connect the dots somehow. And it's harder, no doubt. But we can get, some objective data.
right?
Through
And you can draw inference from that. And, again, I would encourage people to talk to your friends in marketing, because they run these social campaigns, and it's very difficult for them to tie direct sales dollars to those campaigns. There is a very loose connection, and yet they present numbers in their pitches to get those dollars for those campaigns. They have a way to do it. And so, again, I'm not saying to do anything like low integrity. I'm just saying this problem we have, other people in our organization have, and they've gotten good at the judo or whatever you want to call it, that's necessary to get the numbers they need. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into, there were so many great comments. I might just print this comment section, make it into an ebook and sell it. There are some great ideas in here. Let's talk about ROI. Now we're talking about numbers. I want to talk a little bit about ROI. A lot of folks struggle with kind of talking about the ROI for their program and putting it, this was kind of a prelude to it, but like putting it in terms that get them the budget they need, or putting it in terms that turn those light bulbs on for a group of, leaders who maybe, miserly are clutching the purse strings of the organization, or might have a misconception about the role of ethics and compliance, that the role that it can play in the broader organization. When we start thinking about ROI, what are some like simple rocks to look under, or what are some frameworks that, we think resonate deeply with those folks at the board to really show our worth and show our value? Because look, we know that there's an ethical premium, right? We know that, right now, or at least the last report that came out, and this was just focused on public companies. I'd argue it's probably bigger at private companies. There's a 25% premium for the most ethical organization. So it shows up somewhere. It shows up in the things that these folks care about. But how do we draw that line to that sort of bottom line impact that's many times second, 2-3 degrees away from what we're actually touching?
Yeah, I have to go back again. It's, it's the qualitative and quantitative research, to get data, to get information that's more than intuitive. Well, we're pretty sure that we're having this impact. Boards and exec teams want data. And the only way to get that is to, do surveys, do focus groups, do the typical kinds of ways that you gather information on things that don't result from spitting out widgets.
Yeah.
If I can add to that, is we were just talking about how there's there's some things on which you can do the math, and obviously things that you can't, and that's the more of the qualitative. But it's also looking at, I think we touched on this a little bit last week, is to highlight what am I unable to achieve right now based on the resources I have. And that could be personnel, it could be technology, it could be a number of things, right? The tools. And what risks are we now taking because of that gap?
Yeah.
And it's always going to come back down also to a risk appetite discussion as well, right? So we can talk about the return on the investment, my salary, the travel, the tools, et cetera, and what am I able to accomplish? But talking about that gap, right? And what I can't accomplish accordingly. But if we invested in X, Y, and Z, this is going to be the end result. And this is how the risk is going to be more appropriately mitigated, which may map better to the organization's risk appetite. And if you guys aren't having a conversation about risk appetite in your organization, that is a very critical conversation to be having. And that's overall in the overall organization. I don't care if you're sales, marketing, finance, there is a certain risk appetite.
Right.
So I think that's important. And then another thing to tie into that return on the investment is how do you benchmark? And I know we briefly talked about this last week too. Because I get that question a lot. When I was in industry, I got that question a lot from boards, and I get it day in and day out from my clients. And Mike and I just had a recent conversation on this, on benchmarking, because boards like to see, C-suite likes to see, how do we compare to our competitors in all aspects of the business? And compliance is no different, right? So to be able to do a benchmark in whatever areas, make sense as it relates to compliance, there's a long list of what you could do, but that also ties into that ROI, because again, if you have a gap here, that's going to require an additional investment. And frankly, that's what you're trying to achieve.
I think that's spot on. I think, benchmarks are never perfect. Estimates are never perfect.
Right.
Were you going to say something, Mike? I don't want to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, as a compliance officer, to me, this is probably the single biggest challenge I have, is to be able to, I'll use a phrase, show your worth, right? And again, I'll use a silly example that I used earlier. Can I walk into my CEO and say, well, nobody got indicted this month, so your investment in us is clearly working. I mean, that's a stupid benchmark to use, but it's return on investment. How do you know the problems that you're avoiding, right? How do I know what $100 million lawsuit we may have avoided because we had the right internal controls in place? You don't. That's part of the problem. You don't. Now, I suppose if you can identify through your internal controls a potential bribe that would have thrown you into an FCPA situation that could have cost the company upwards of $50 million, $100 million, $1 billion, the way those cases goes, then you can. But I think that's also like the rarity when you can really truly show where you've had your value. I think you can do it in some circumstances. I think this is for compliance officers. This may be one of the hardest tasks we have, is being able to essentially show what we're worth. How is this $1 million investment in this new technology actually avoiding potential problems?
Yeah.
Well, I love this discussion. I love the ROI discussion because I mean, this is going to sound kind of arrogant, but I don't think it's that hard. I think it is. I think we have to widen our scope a little bit, and I think we have to stop focusing just on risk. Risk is absolutely pain avoidance. Let's talk about pain avoidance. Lawsuits reduced. Absolutely, that's part of it. But there's another two components. Risk avoidance is one, pain avoidance. The second one is efficiencies. Anne-Marie, you kind of alluded to that. And then the third one is the strategic impact in the organization. And Angie just said, you know what, these younger generations, I mean, look, you can look at any of the reports, 92% of people are willing to change organizations, all else equal, to go to one that has higher integrity. 68% of people who quit during the Great Resignation on a primary or secondary basis left because they didn't believe in the mission of the company. That means that the mission, the values on the wall was not actually being lived out. So with labor mobility as high as it is, with the cost of switching jobs as low as it is, people are willing to hop the fence and see that greener pasture on the other side. And if what we're doing helps drive cultures of more integrity, if what we're doing closes that gap between the aspirational and the actual culture, then we need to figure out a way to get some credit for that. And the way that we've had a lot of success helping folks get that credit and get that extra budget is by incorporating some of those things into our ROI analysis. So the efficiency one, that's pretty easy. The cost avoidance one, I'm going to talk about a quick concept here about expected value in a second. But the one that really moves the needle is the turnover piece, which is higher than it's ever been at every single organization that I've looked at in the last year and a half, and the employee engagement piece. Employee engagement is just the extent to which people are putting the foot down on the gas, and across the globe, it's somewhere between 65 and 68%. So one half of 1 percentage point that falls directly to the bottom line. And are we going to say, well, that's all due to us? Well, no, we're not going to say that. But also, any increase in that from our efficacy being actually felt across the organization should be somewhere on the top of that numerator divided by the investment. You know what I'm saying? So. And then there's this other concept of expected value that I think a lot of us in the ethics and compliance game, we don't build into our ROI discussions. And so if I had a game where there we go. Okay. If I flip the coin and it lands on heads and you get $100 and it lands on tails, you get $0. What is that game worth? The expected value of that game is 50% times 100 plus 50% times 0, right? That's a $50 game. So in theory, you would pay anything under $50 to play that game because at scale, that's going to be a profitable game for you. Well, we don't have to know exactly how much lawsuits we avoided, but we can make some estimate of like how much does a CIA cost for an organization of this size on just an explicit basis. What's the cost for a monitor and all those things, and how much does that cost over the next 6 years? And we can say, if we have a full program in place, I'm just brainstorming a little bit, but if we have a full program in place, I'm not saying we're going to wave a magic wand and never get into any kind of trouble, but I think we can reduce that risk by 1%. Does that sound reasonable, CFO? And he's going to say, yeah, it's probably going to be more than that. It's probably going to be 5%. And then now we're starting to open their mind to the impact that our role has on the broader organization in a framework that they speak. They speak estimates and guesses in the context of, you know, like imperfect information. Nobody has like a crystal ball. So when they're doing an acquisition, they look at all the diligence and they look at all those numbers and they build a financial model that is, you know, the basis for them to make those, you know, to cut that big check to buy this company. We have a bunch of that fodder in our own operation that if we can just start widening our scope beyond the specifically identifiable things of I avoided this FCPA violation to some of these other things that clearly, based on all the data that's out there, clearly resonates with our workforce, which is largely across the board, like our biggest cost. We play a role in that. We're the circulatory system to the organization. So I'm kind of ranting and raving a little bit because I'm so excited about this. We've done about 15 of these over the last couple of months, getting together with folks and helping them build their ROI pitch. And like, if I had this batting average that we've had in baseball, I'd be in the Hall of Fame. Okay. So this is not because I'm so smart, but it's just bringing some new frameworks to some really smart people who already, the answers are right there. You know what I'm saying? So I love this whole kind of discussion because there's estimates we can make, like Angie said, from qualitative data. There's numbers we can get from a quantitative perspective. There's external sources that we can use to build our case, because either we're a one-dimensional thing, a check the box thing, or we are this true circulatory system of the organization. And that ethical premium that we see out there is real. I believe it to be real. I see it in my own business. I see it in other businesses that are really firing on all cylinders from an ethics forward, compliance forward perspective, and just capturing a piece of that. It has so many positive externalities, not just for our own careers and our roles in our organization, but for the ultimate like workplace that we can end up building. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I could keep going on this, so I will stop, but this has been like a lot of fun. We had so many more questions we didn't even get to, so many phenomenal comments. Thank you all for sharing your insights. John, I'll follow up with you after this, because you just dropped a pretty big question here, which maybe I'll answer after we roll off. But round of applause for our panelists, FTI, the folks from FTI, for Mike. You guys were really very generous with your time. This was a really fun, organic discussion, which I always love. I always love leaving a discussion like this with a couple of new talk tracks that I can share with other people that, make them think I'm smart. So that's great. So appreciate you guys very much. Let's drop some scores in the chat on where this was on a scale of 0 to 9. I'm looking for a lot of 9s here. I'm looking for 1,000 9s if we can get them. But guys, thank you so much. Replay, of course, will be available. We'll send around, we'll send something around once it's all done, getting buttoned up. And until next week, what do we have coming up, Jack? We got a really good one next week. It's actually perfect for this. We're talking about how to be more effective, more resonant with the board and the CEO. So that's going to be a panel discussion hosted by Matt Kelly of Radical Compliance fame, the coolest guy in compliance. So you don't want to miss that next Thursday at noon. Yeah. Love you guys. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.